what I'm going to talk about tonight is mostly focused on New York City and specifically on Staten Island, but it's about some of the post-Hurricane Sandy resilience measures that have been being implemented by the city. On October 30th, 2012, a resident of Staten Island's southeastern shore, a man who I'll call Sam, came home from being evacuated to find that Hurricane Sandy had lifted his house off of its foundation and moved it down the block. 1 year later, Sam was still fighting with FEMA trying to get an estimate on his property damage. The problem was that when insurance adjusters would come out to do the inspection, they could never find his house. So they would leave and call him and tell him that he had given them the wrong address. And this went on for quite a while. So aside from raising issues of FEMA-related fraud, this story actually includes several bitter ironies. One of them is the fact that a few years back, Sam had actually launched a campaign with support from his local neighbors to oppose a new housing development on a small vacant lot behind his house. Since the 1980s and 90s, new development had been really ramping up on in the southeastern part of Staten Island. And in the early 2000s, with an influx of global capital, it really took off. And this was much to the concern of local residents. First, waterfront neighborhoods do not, in these particular areas, do not have storm sewers. So vacant lots really functioned as an essential piece of storm infrastructure. And second, beach erosion was far outpacing the installation of flood protections. And again, new developments were, a lot of them were on the waterfront, and they were really accelerating this process. So people who lived there could really see this happening before their eyes, and they really opposed a lot of the new development, but they were unable to stem the tide. And as in most neighborhoods in the area, townhouse and multifamily developments proliferated. And we all know the consequences of that proliferation of development. So across the island on the North Shore, the damage was not nearly as severe, although it did wash up this tanker onto the beach. And that's a picture of flooding on the North Shore. But it was still extensive. North Shore residents believe that they dodged a bullet, as their neighborhoods were actually even more vulnerable to storms than the South and East Shores. So the North Shore sits on the edge of the Kilvan Kull, which is a narrow tidal strait that divides Staten Island from Bayonne, New Jersey. And during the industrial era, the city installed a port here, which continues to be one of the East Coast's busiest ports. Historically, the port attracted a large number of industries as well as immigrants seeking jobs. Still today, one 5.2-mile strip contains 21 industrial sites, and all of these 21 sites contain some kind of uncontrolled hazardous waste. And you can see that the residential neighborhoods go right up into the industrial strip. This area also houses a large number of migrant communities, including recent migrants from Liberia, Trinidad, Albania, China, Mexico, and Central America. A lot of people don't know that about Staten Island. And unemployment runs high. 15% of households fall below the poverty line. So these demographics, combined with the large number of industrial toxic sites, makes the North Shore what we would call a typical environmental justice community. And that's, you can see the red dots are industrial sites, and the dark lines would be the population in poverty, and then this is similar map done by percent African American. So as on the South and East Shores, infrastructure here is really a huge issue. Storm and sewer lines are woefully outdated and inadequate. Millions of gallons of storm overrun are discharged into the Kilvan Kull each year, and flooding is very common. In addition, bulkheads, berms, and other flood protections are inconsistent and often in disrepair. That's one of my favorite pictures. It's sort of blurry, but that's a center, a recreation center that's like kind of on a jetty, was on a jetty. and it collapsed in 2010 because the infrastructure underneath it just kind of rotted away. Nobody was in it. It collapsed in the middle of the night. So had Sandy's trajectory, the trajectory of the actual storm gone slightly differently and hit the North Shore as hard as it did the South, the proportions of this disaster would have been much greater, and flooding would have not only destroyed lives and property, but the water could have circulated toxic chemicals and redistributed them. So the point is that one part of the tragedy of Hurricane Sandy is that Staten Island residents, a lot of them, knew that they were at risk. And as you know, they live on an island. So they were very aware of flooding problems and of problems of flood protection, and they had spent years trying to advocate for better protections and less development. So after the storm, some neighborhoods that had seen extensive damage signed on to petitions, and this is on the southeast shores where the entire neighborhoods were wiped out, and they asked to get bought out. They signed a petition asking the state to buy out their properties and return it to wetlands, which is highly unusual for disaster survivors who normally demand the right to return to their neighborhood. But these people had really lost all faith in the city's ability to keep them safe. As one woman said, "We did everything right, and this is what we get." And what she means is they had bought flood insurance, they had, insured their homes, they were property owners, which is, what you're supposed to do in this country. And then they were just everything got destroyed. So some of these neighborhoods did get the buyouts that they wanted, and that land is being returned to wetlands. But in other neighborhoods that are getting buyouts, what's happening is the city has reserved the right to redevelop the land in more resilient ways. And so some of that new development is already starting to break ground. So there's a lot of work that is being done, and this is the kind of positive side after Sandy on the beaches on the south and east shores of Staten Island that is really helping improve the flooding situation. They're putting a lot more sand in, they're putting berms, but they're still not updating the storm sewer system, and they have plans for more dense housing, and so that's a cause of great concern to people who live there. Another cause of concern is what I'm going to kind of talk about for the rest of this, which is a measure that was recently approved, which is for mitigation banking. And so this is was a highly controversial measure among environmentalists and environmental justice activists in the city. So briefly, a mitigation bank is aimed at solving a problem of development where developers currently, if you're developing on the waterfront and you're going to do something that interferes with an ecosystem, like throwing some shade or causing some erosion, you have to make up for that. And so you find a way to either mitigate what you're going to do or kind of invest in a project nearby that's going to help an ecosystem. But what the city's Office of Economic Development, the EDC, has been trying to do for years is to install a program that is currently available in some other states where if you can't find a good way to mitigate the damage for your development, you invest in a bank, a mitigation bank, which is like a large wetland project. And the idea is that you buy these credits and you invest in this larger wetland. So you get more bang for the buck, because the argument is that the little piecemeal projects that people were doing weren't really doing that much good, but like a large wetland restoration project is better. So, and I'm going through this quickly, but I can explain it more slowly later. So basically, the EDC was trying to do this for years under Bloomberg, and the Bloomberg administration really was trying to get these mitigation banks because they thought that development was very much hindered by the environmental regulations. But they couldn't get the funding to do a pilot program. So what does this all have to do with Hurricane Sandy? Well, after trying for years to find funding for a mitigation bank, the EDC finally applied for $12 million from Sandy relief money to fund this Marshes project, and they won that. So they got that from the federal government. So This is the site of the pilot program for mitigation banking, which is on Staten Island. It's a 68-acre saltwater marsh. And according to this EDC, it's become an informal dump. And the restored marsh will be a healthy habitat for flora and fauna. Also, the agency says that the half-mile area surrounding the site is occupied by 200 businesses and 20,000 residents, and they'll all be protected by the restored wetland. So that all sounds good, but the interesting part is that environmental groups in this area say that the wetland is already pretty vibrant and that there are a lot of species of flora and fauna already on it, and that the 200 businesses are planned for the area they want to put in an industrial park, but they don't actually exist right now. So when they're saying that they're protecting all of these people, that there's, the opponents of the program say that those people aren't there. So there are really far-reaching implications of establishing a mitigation bank program in New York City. And so that's why it caused alarm among not just the very local environmental groups, but environmental groups across the city, and also national groups, including the Sierra Club, Riverkeeper, Good Jobs New York, Clean Air Campaign, and they've all staunchly opposed the program. And mainly it's because, okay, so for the environmental justice groups, if you allow developers to buy credits into one mitigation bank, say on Staten Island, that means that they can develop in the Bronx and kind of develop into the waterfront there, but then mitigate totally, way over in Staten Island. So it doesn't do anything to help protect the people who live in the Bronx. And then on the environmentalist side, the bank is just disastrous for the protection of wildlife because, again, if you're going to disturb an ecosystem, in one part of the city, but you're restoring an ecosystem in the other part, it doesn't mean that it's the same ecosystem necessarily, or you're going to get the same protection of wildlife or the same kind of birds or whatever go there. So they really think that this is just kind of not a logical way to go about mitigation. And it also, there was language in this proposal that allows for in-water development. So it allows for the mitigation of in-water development, which, if any of you know, is a proposal out there to put developments on barges in the Hudson River. Someone's nodding their heads. You know about it. And they're going to do it. I think they're talking about a heliport and maybe an entertainment complex, and they'll be in these barges. They're allowed to dock for 6 months, and then they have to move. But the point is that if those are going to be disrupting ecosystems, which they probably will, then they can buy the credits into the mitigation bank to offset what they're doing. And so this is really problematic for a lot of environmental groups. But it didn't really get a lot of attention in the press or locally. So that's one thing that I'm continuing to sort of puzzle out, is why this issue. I think maybe because it's extremely complicated to explain, but it just didn't, and this was part of resilience money, which a lot of people consider just a total outrage. But if this should tell us anything, it should alert us to the resilience of the status quo in New York City, which is really pro-development, and the degree to which we cannot be sanguine in accepting easy solutions to pernicious problems. Rather, if we want a truly resilient city, we will need to be vigilant about watching for policies that do exactly the opposite of what they promise. It's the least we can do because very real lives are at stake. Thank you.